Okay, we may begin when you're ready, Dr. Pawlik or Dr. Fuentes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Aido. All right, so hello again and greetings from the Traces Laboratory at the Areté in Ateneo de Manila University. And thank you very much for your interest in our archaeology webinar series and for joining us today for an exciting talk on the deep human history of the Philippines. As always, this webinar is jointly facilitated by Aido Balboa, Dr. Riczar Fuentes, and myself. And this webinar series is supported by the members of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the School of Social Sciences, Areté, the Creativity and Innovation Hub of the Ateneo de Manila University, and the Eduardo J. Aboitis Sandbox Zone. I will now hand over to Dr. Fuentes, who will introduce our distinguished guest and speaker, Dr. Hugo Reyes-Centeno. Thank you, and Rick, it's your turn.
Good morning, everyone. Our speaker for today, Dr. Hugo Reyes-Centeno, is a dear friend and colleague. We thank him for taking time to present and share his expertise and knowledge. Dr. Reyes-Centeno studies human evolution over the last million years, investigating the emergence of human anatomy as well as the mode and timing of modern human dispersals. In addition, he conducts interdisciplinary research on the association between anatomical, genetic, and linguistic diversity. His broader scientific interests include evolutionary theory and the application of virtual methods in archaeology and paleontology. Dr. Reyes-Centeno completed a bachelor's degree in the Department of Anthropological Sciences at Stanford University, an Erasmus Mundus International Master in Quaternary and Prehistory in the Department of Biology and Evolution at the University of Ferrara in Italy, and a doctoral degree in the Institute of Archaeological Sciences at the University of Tübingen and the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and Paleoenvironment in Germany. He was scientific coordinator of the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies, called the Words, Bones, Genes, Tools, at the University of Tübingen prior to appointment to assistant professor at the University of Kentucky in 2020, with his work based at the William S. Webb Museum of Anthropology. He has performed paleontological and archaeological fieldwork in France, Italy, Peru, the Philippines, and Spain. He is well published with papers in prestigious journals such as Cell, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Journal of Human Evolution, Scientific Reports, the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, and many others. I will now hand over to Dr. Hugo Reyes-Centeno and his talk on the human biocultural diversity in the Philippines 700,000 years ago to today. So thank you so much, and thank you, Hugo.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you, Dr. Pollock, for the invitation, first of all, and for the very generous introduction. It's my pleasure to join you all. I'm glad to see there's interest in this topic. It's quite diverse what I'll talk about today because I am an anthropologist first and foremost, trained in the four-field approach of anthropology. So I actually work really across all of the sub-disciplines, including archaeology, including evolutionary biology. To some degree, also collaborate a lot with linguists and cultural anthropologists and sociologists. So you'll see some of that reflected in what I'll talk about today. So I do want to briefly just mention that research framework of how I approach the study of the human past, broadly speaking, and then go into specifics about the peopling of Southeast Asia and the very important role that the Philippines has in understanding human occupation in this region. And I'll finish up by some research perspectives as to how my laboratory and many of my collaborators are addressing some of the most important questions about human occupation in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. So the framework that I use to study human evolution is to understand the origin of our species. And there's a wide agreement now about this being in Africa, and Africa really being the center point for this. And then also understanding the mode and timing of dispersals out of Africa and into other parts of the world. So if you've been following this series, you've heard from Dr. Azzarello about the peopling of Europe, and I'll mention some of the perspectives of the eastern parts of Eurasia, and particularly Southeast Asia. And then I also, of course, am interested in adaptations to new environments. So as humans dispersed out of Africa into new environments, how has that been impacted? And I know some of you have attended Dr. Amano's talk as well in understanding the case of Sri Lanka. So, all of these things are intertied, and my research program is really looking at the origin and dispersals into Southeast Asia. So broadly speaking, as Dr. Fuentes already mentioned, we're talking about the last 1 million years of human evolution, beginning in Africa, and then some of the early time periods of modern human occupation is what I specialize in. And you'll see some of that reflected in an overview. And then I do work in other parts of the world, including some of the earliest occupations in the Americas as well. Well, that's a topic for another day. Now, within this framework, of course, we were asking scientific questions, but the way to address these often involves an understanding that this is world heritage, and that we're looking at a cultural and natural heritage that is important for all of humanity. So my approach is really to understand the legacy of the past and what we live with today, what we dig up as archaeologists is often the case, and what we pass on to future generations. So as is said by UNESCO, the UN Education, Science and Culture Organization, indeed our cultural and natural heritage are both irreplaceable sources of life and inspiration. So broadly, we really are interested in looking at and understanding cultural inheritance as well as biological inheritance. And most of the times we're using the fields of archaeology, but also the fields of linguistics for the very deep time periods, fields of paleontology. And then for some very detailed aspects of some of these questions, we want to look at DNA and use genomic approaches for this. So they're all complementary, ultimately all important in understanding the human past. And then, if we're talking about a scientific process, well, we're understanding the cultural and biological processes of the human past. So I'll start off with what I'm most familiar with and where I work, where I spend most of my time, which is with the fossil record, the human fossil record, and that's the paleontological aspect. And not only is there agreement of human origins, so of all of our ancestors in Africa, but there's also agreement on the origin of the species and the genus Homo in Africa more than 2 million years ago. Usually we refer to these fossils as Homo habilis, and then the later ones as Homo ergaster or Homo erectus. And it's those latter representatives that first went out of the continent into Eurasia broadly. You've heard the case from Dr. Azzarello, and of course into Southeast Asia, where there's a relatively rich fossil record of the erectus taxon. So we have some evidence from China beginning at 1.7 million years ago. So really shortly after we see the occurrence within Africa, and in parts of Indonesia shortly thereafter as well. Now, these are, of course, some of the better known parts of the fossil record. And there certainly are others, and I'm only pointing to the fossils, but there are certainly many.
Hugo, sorry, excuse me. The slides are not presented. Not in.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Let's see. Let me switch that up.
Thanks.
I'm using 3 different screens, so I think this is part of the issue. All right, how's that?
Yep, it's working now. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, I'm sorry you didn't see all of these, but I'll just skip quickly through them. All right, and so that brings us to where we left off. So, after we find some of these very early representatives of the Erectus taxon in Asia, we do find some very interesting fossils and also cultural artifacts in association, some that include the Kalinga stone tool remains in the Philippines at 700,000. So this is a very recent find, one that has really changed our understanding of human occupation in Asia, because we didn't have that until very recently. And there are others, again, I'm mentioning primarily the fossils here, like the Narmada cranium from India, and the Chinese fossil record is tremendously rich, and it's particularly these fossils, not only because they're very complete, but also because of their dating, that are tremendously important in trying to understand what has happened in Asia after the appearance of Erectus. So we actually don't all agree as to what taxon we would refer to these fossils. So you can look at the Harbin specimen represented here, and some of the others from China that look quite different than the earlier fossils from China and Indonesia. And so they've sometimes been referred to as Homo heidelbergensis, sometimes as new species. Nowadays, we're often speculating that they might be representatives of Denisovans, and I'll tell you what that is in just a minute. But before we get into that topic, I do want to go back to this understanding of modern human origins in Africa. So looking now at more recent time periods, we do see fossils that essentially look like us, particularly in their cranial anatomy, in Africa, starting at about 200,000 years ago. And then only later do we see fossils outside of Africa that also share affinities, not only with those fossils, but of course with representatives of our species living today. Some of the best known evidence has come from the Middle East, including the Kafze and skull crania that you see represented there, as well as the Mislia mandible. And then more controversially, a set of fossils that include this premolar from the Punung site in Indonesia, which dates to about 120,000 years ago. The Fuyan dental assemblage, and the dental assemblage from Zirandong and Lunandong, purported to be at earlier than 100,000 years before present. So if we accept these dates from Southeast Asia, then this really means that we have an overlap of some of these earlier fossils that really don't look like any of us today, and certainly not like the earliest humans in Africa. So think of the Harbin and the Mamba crania. Those are represented here and here. This is Dali, this is Mamba, and this is Harbin. And so the question has been quite an intriguing one. Did modern humans overlap with some of these so-called archaic populations? And if so, it brings really a range of questions. If they interacted, what do their descendants look like if they interacted biologically and had successful offspring? If they interacted in that way, they probably also interacted in cultural and linguistic ways. So did they understand each other? Did they share technical production strategies to understand some of the tools that we find in the archaeological record? And perhaps they also influence the way that they organize themselves, their social organization. But all of these, I have to say, we don't have answers for, but this is one of the reasons why it's such an exciting time to do paleontology and archaeology in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines in particular, because the Philippines, as I mentioned, we had previously thought was occupied only by modern humans, and increasingly there's evidence, including the Kalinga assemblage of lithic remains, that suggest someone was there much earlier. Probably someone that would have looked like some of the fossils you see represented here, but this is still a big question mark. Were they descended from those populations? Would we classify them as Homo erectus? And then they interact with modern humans. So it used to be that the occupation of Homo erectus was thought to be as late as about 30,000 years ago, but some of the latest evidence suggests that at least in Indonesia, they would have been found up to 130,000 years ago, which then limits the time frame that modern humans would have overlapped in Indonesia at least. But for the Philippines, this is really an open question at the moment, because the record that we have between that earliest occupation at 700,000 up until about 70,000 is just completely unknown. And there's a lot really to be answered in the case of the Philippine archipelago. Now, all of these fossil remains have brought back some of the old questions about human origins, about the origin of our own species. And these are the four models that have been debated for the last 50 years or so. Including one that sees modern human origins in Africa and their dispersal into Asia, replacing all forms, including Homo erectus and including some of these more enigmatic Middle Pleistocene fossils that we find in the record. So that's at one extreme. At another extreme, the view that sees that these populations interacted consistently throughout the last 1.5 million years ago. And then more intermediate models, which is where we are tending to agree on now, where we see that there is this early dispersal of Homo erectus into Asia, and at some point interaction with modern humans expanding out of Africa later on. So again, the Philippine record is very important. Other than the 700,000 year record, we don't really find good, well-dated evidence until about 67,000 years ago in Luzon, which has been used to name this new species Homo luzonensis, consisting of a series of postcranial remains as well as several teeth. And then modern human occupation later on in other areas, including Palawan with Tabonban. And then, of course, there's very interesting history thereafter. So anthropologists have been very interested in this dynamic for a long time. And the Philippines has always been a central point because there's been an association that if we consider multiple dispersals of humans into Southeast Asia, then where we need to be looking are at some of the indigenous populations in the region. And for the Philippines, that is looking at the Negrito. The term, of course, is one that's largely overused, I would say. It's very broad to describe indigenous populations with a darker complexion, coming, of course, from a colonial term meaning black. And some modern day Negritos use this term, others prefer to use their own name in their own language. So it's a term that I use to refer to indigenous populations broadly, and those specifically that have been hypothesized to be some of the early occupants of the Philippine archipelago. So back some time ago in 2014, I tested different models for the occupation of Southeast Asia, those that you see listed here. So in the first, having just one dispersal of modern humans, so we have modern human origins, and then a single dispersal out of Africa. via a so-called northern route. And then in number 2, a so-called southern route. So the only difference here being that the mode of exodus of that early dispersal. So certain populations living today, not only the Negritos in the case of the Philippines, but also Australian Aborigines, as well as Dravidian speakers from India, for example. And then a fourth model that is sort of intermediate of these two is that some populations would be descendants of this early dispersal, primarily those in Australia, whereas others would be admixed populations of both dispersals. So the data that was used to try to understand this scenario was anatomical data, so looking at aspects of dental morphology as well as cranial anatomy, and in many cases looking at very detailed aspects of this. So things like a trait here represented called dental shoveling, where in many East Asian populations as well as Native American populations, we have this shoveled morphology of the incisors, so the front teeth, represented here from category 3 to 6, whereas in other populations, including Europeans and Africans, you have this very flat kind of dental morphology in the back part. So you can feel it in yourself if you just roll your tongue in the back of your front teeth, whether they're relatively flat or whether they're relatively shoveled. And we've done a lot of work to try to understand which of these traits are most informative for looking at population history by comparing that morphology to genetic variation, and have found that some traits are better than others. So we would use then those traits that you see represented here. This is from a test of 27 different traits to test these kinds of models. And the models have been best represented in testing this hypothesis are 2 and 3, depending on the data that we use. So it's sort of a compromise where we can say we have likely multiple dispersals out of Africa, not necessarily leading to descendants today, but certainly that there is this geographical patterning of populations moving into Southeast Asia specifically. So really an intermediate model between 2 and 3 here. And so this really falsifies some of these models that we've had before and some that were quite popular just 20, 30 years ago of the out of Africa replacement and multi-regional model, and instead something much more complex that looks and entertains at these multiple dispersals, differentially affecting the biology of people today. So it looks something more like this. This was already proposed a long time ago, and the more genomic data we collect, the more it seems that this kind of model is being supported. And of course, if we're talking about more recent time periods, we also have to envision that there's a lot of admixture in very recent time, and these are all things that we have to, of course, take into account. So in the case of the Philippines, there's, of course, not only those very deep time periods of human occupation, but more recent colonial, Spanish, later American, of course, Chinese time periods as well. So it's really quite a melting pot, making things a bit more complicated, but certainly also very interesting. So when the evidence for Homo luzonensis came out, this really begged the question of where we place this taxon in this kind of scheme. So I'm trying to conceptualize how humans have evolved within the archipelago. So can we consider it a descendant of Homo erectus, perhaps? And that would certainly mean that we see some of the last occupation in all of Asia. Remember that Indonesia is now thought to be much earlier at 130,000, whereas the evidence from Luzon is coming at about 70,000 years ago? Or can this be related to some of these more enigmatic fossils that we saw from China, like Dali and Mamba? Now we do have a bit more evidence from the fossil record, and that is namely this mandible that you see here from Tibet, which has not been studied as well morphologically, so the anatomy has not been studied in great detail, but has been studied genomically, and not in terms of DNA, but actually some of the proteins that were extracted from this fossil. And that has been classified as a Denisova, and that's in comparison to the type site that was named for in Russia. It was first identified there with just that single tooth and some finger bones that you see represented there. You see a molar tooth there in the top left. And it's actually really known primarily genomically because of only these remains being found. So we don't have a nice complete cranium as we do from the Chinese specimens. And this really limits then our understanding of the kinds of humans that were existing during that time. But it leaves the possibility that there could be an association with the fossils from Luzon, from Luzonensis. And this is of great interest because if that's the case, what we're also finding now, now this is a work from several collaborators, including David Reich, and more recent work that's not shown here from Maximilian Larena at the University of Uppsala. What they found is that when you look at Negrito populations in the Philippines, including the Acta in northern Luzon, the Aita in southern Luzon, as well as the Mamanwa in Mindanao in the very south of the Philippines, and other groups like the Batang, we actually see this genomic signature in their genome. So these are people living in the Philippines today that carry this very deep signal of what is found in Russia hundreds of thousands of years ago. And we can also look, so that's what you see on the graph on the right. On the left, what you see is also some of the proportions for other populations in Oceania. So Australians and Papuans also carry this signal. And I should say that now this is a bit outdated here because some of the work from Maximilian Larena has shown that it's actually the Aeta that carry the most proportion of Denisovans. So even more of a reason why Philippines is a place to study diversity of humans, not only today, but also in the deep past. So perhaps Luzonensis is a Denisovan, perhaps it's a late Erectus. This is a question that is still left to be addressed. And how might we be able to answer that? Well, you can see that the remains that we do have of Denisovans and Luzonensis are primarily dental remains. And so if we appreciate the fact that modern day Oceanians, Papuans, and Negritos from the Philippines carry a large component that is derived from Denisovans, it's reasonable to think that perhaps some of their anatomies might also reflect that. And specifically what we would then need to compare it to is to their teeth, because that's what we have from both. So of course, dentists are always looking at our teeth, and this is something that, of course, that we as anthropologists also do, and that could be done to do some comparisons with some of these early fossils. And this is interesting because we're learning more and more about how some of these anatomies are related to very specific parts of the genome. So as we get more data of genomic data of Denisovans, as we get more genomic data of Negrito populations and Oceanians, we can then start to make some inferences about the changes over time in their anatomy. This is well known now for how the crania are different between Neanderthals that you see on the left, which have a very elongated cranium, in comparison to someone like ourselves, that you see on the right in blue, which have a much more rounded and what we call globular neurocranium, so more like a ball rather than an oval shape. And so this is, of course, something that we want to carry forward, is to keep understanding the morphologies and keep understanding the DNA of people living in the deep past, as well as people living today, that really hold the key to addressing these questions. From another side that we can approach it is that by looking at the dental morphology and overall the mandibular and maxillary morphology, so the morphology of our jaws, we can actually begin to understand some of the differences in the sounds that we produce and ultimately the languages that we speak. So what's been appreciated for some time now and now studied in greater detail is that people that have an overbite, and that's usually agriculturalist populations, tend to produce certain sounds, what we call in linguistics fricatives. So those that produce sounds like F and V and allow us to connect the bottom part of our lip or our tongue with the top part of our teeth at a greater frequency than those that do not have this overbite. This is what you see here in terms of production of those kinds of so-called labiodental sounds, that in those populations that are primarily hunter-gatherers that you see in blue, including Oceanians and including hunter-gatherers, namely the Negritos in the Philippines, they have in their languages higher frequency this production of labiodentals or fricative sounds. So to explore all of this in a multidisciplinary fashion, what we've done is to form a consortium of universities that are interested in these kinds of questions. This is directed because it was funded by the European Union by European institutions that you see listed here, including University of Tübingen, where I was based before, as well as University of Uppsala in Sweden, where Maximilian Areno, who's a Filipino himself, is conducting most of the genomic work. And there are many other institutions here, and of course, many more to list of institutions in the Philippines that we're working with. So this is a consortium that in the next 5 years is made to provide really the resources and platform for addressing some of these kinds of multidisciplinary questions. We did start fieldwork pre-pandemic in January 2020, and of course at that time the virus was limited to cases in China, and just as I left the Philippines, we had one case recorded. So suffice it to say that we've had to postpone a lot of the work there for the moment, but it's certainly something that we will carry forward as soon as it's possible. What we were able to do was to meet with some of the groups, including the Mamanwa that you see here. Of course, we see them as our collaborators. And at this point, we're not collecting data. This is really this was really a time to explain what we wanted to do and see, one, whether they were interested, but of course, two, what questions they might have for us and questions that they're interested in addressing themselves. So no data collection really in this field season. It was really a time to form rapport, and of course working with other local scholars in conjunction with this process. Other pictures that you see here with the Areté and my colleague Maximilian in the forefront and myself in the back. And giving these, community halls to try to establish these connections with indigenous groups. So that's, one area that's of active research that we will carry forward as soon as it's possible, and as soon as we have the support from indigenous communities and all the respective institutions in the Philippines. And, I mentioned that what's important is to understand questions that indigenous groups would have as well. And this is, crucial not only for understanding biocultural diversity broadly, but for understanding, research questions that we as scientists, and particularly myself as a non-Filipino, non-indigenous Filipino, may not even think of. So our collaboration at IFUGAO, at the International Innovation Center for Indigenous Studies, is tremendously important in that regard. Those of you in the Philippines would know that, of course, this region is very well known for the rice paddies, and it's an UNESCO site, but it's also well known for some of the mummification processes that have occurred in more recent time periods. So this was actually one thing that the communities were interested in learning more about. Was not under our purview for addressing scientifically, but because it was something that they wanted addressed, we started to collaborate with them on this, and specifically with the mummy from Apoano in the Cordilleran region of Luzon, where there's a rich history of, as told by the communities there. And in this case, we're not talking about Negrito communities, we're talking about Cordillerans. And so Apoano has this revered status as the offspring of a human father and a mountain spirit. And there's a long history of this mummy where it was not known where it was for a long time. It was eventually retrieved by the National Museum in Manila in the 1990s and then repatriated to the Cordilleras in 1999, where it's maintained today. And it's interesting because the mummification process that is used on this consists of smoking methods and use of botanicals. So very different, for example, in what sometimes are more famous mummies, those of Egypt, for example. And, this is something that the community is interested in understanding more as well. In general, because of this mummification process, there's excellent preservation, but there is some endangerment for this. So we've gone into to take a look back in January when we did some field work here. And the approach, in this case, showing an Egyptian mummy, is to do a scan of it as a means of preservation. So this is something that the community was interested in acquiring from our end, so that they could not put the actual mummy on display, but have a digital rendering of it. And so you can create a 3D reconstruction of it. And then the other component for the case of Apoano and many of these mummies is not only that they've been mummified in very specific ways, but have also been tattooed throughout their bodies. And this is a practice that is found still today in the Kalinga region. So what we wanted to try was to do what is called multispectral imaging. And this is a way of looking at the various different ways that light is reflected on an object and looking at different spectra of color. And what we then do is to essentially create multiple images at a time, which usually will allow us to look at aspects of the image that we cannot really appreciate with the naked eye. That's by focusing then on a very specific range of the way that light is reflected. So this works by taking a lot of photographs on this. These are some on the Apoano mummy. And you cannot appreciate completely what they are because they're very close up to the mummy, but you can appreciate nevertheless the complexity of some of these tattoos. And so we have both a digital rendering of the 3D image as well as these images that have been undertaken through this multispectral imaging process to try to look at some of the differences with respect to the different colors involved. So you can see, for example, just under the part of the side part of the body, that there appears to be a symbol that's not very well represented just by the naked eye, but is very well represented when we look at it using this kind of approach. So the future for this specific case is to potentially answer some of the other questions that the community is interested in by running different kinds of analyses, understanding more of its demography, health profile, potentially looking at some of the botanicals that were used in the mummification process, because it's not a process that's used anymore by local Cordilleran populations, but that they are interested in learning more about. And essentially really continuing that collaborative process. If it's possible, of course, we want to look at the Cordilleran dental anatomy in addition to the many Negrito populations to get at that question of whether we can actually associate it to the morphology of Homo luzonensis or some of the other Middle Pleistocene fossils from other parts of Asia, and in particular, of course, those from Denisova Cave and the specimen from Tibet that has been determined to be Denisovan as well. And so we're working with these different communities on the Cordilleran side and the Negrito side. So more to come from this. Of course, we're happy to take on collaborations with others as well. So certainly be in touch if this sounds of interest to you. In general, really the goal is to bring this research framework that I mentioned in the very beginning and attribute the different aspects of the evolutionary processes happening not only at a biological level, but also at a cultural level, to contextualize human evolution in Southeast Asia, and in particular in the Philippines. And then ideally also collecting linguistic data to understand the Austronesian expansion. So all Negritos today, even though they might be descendant, or at least partially descended from a very ancient dispersal into the continent, speak an Austronesian language. So we want to understand that process as well. And really how correlated are all these different lines of evidence, and can we reconstruct the Austronesian expansion and the diversity of Austronesian languages into other parts of Oceania, and ultimately what legacy some of these extinct populations like Denisovans and Luzonensis might have left in people today. So as I mentioned, we are based, of course, at European institutions, but also collaborate with many Southeast Asian partners, many in the Philippines, to develop some of these research questions, and are continuously in a process of collaborating with indigenous communities and getting, of course, permits for working with them. Now, the last thing I'll mention, just as a closing, is some of the other opportunities, because this work was started in Tübingen, where I was based before, but I'm now, as you have seen, at the University of Kentucky. So we're a small group for the moment. My laboratory, the Human Evolution and Virtual Archaeology laboratory, consists of, at the moment, 2 doctoral candidates, 1 master's student and 2 undergraduates, but we're a growing group. And we're also part of the EDUCE lab, which is developing infrastructure for next generation heritage science at the William S. Webb Museum. So this, at the one hand, I've already outlined the conceptual research framework. And of course, to do all of this, we need the infrastructure to develop it. And that's the stage that we'll develop in tandem over the next 5 years by bringing in a range of methodologies, including what I've mentioned before, multispectral imaging, CT scans, also optical microscopy, XRF, SEM, some of that, if you're an archaeologist, you might already be familiar with. And then mobile units that we can take to the field. So rather than bringing things to Kentucky, or for that matter to Europe, we can bring some of that technology to the Philippines and to other parts of the world. So that's an ongoing process over the next 5 years, and some that I hope will inspire some of you to join us in collaboration. So just to finish, I want to reiterate how exciting it is a time to be studying the Philippines, where for the longest time it was really thought that it was nothing but modern humans inhabiting the archipelago. But now we have this huge gap of very good evidence at 700,000 years ago in Luzon, at least. And 70,000, where we have very little evidence to fill those gaps. And we know Luzon quite well. We don't know other parts like Mindanao and some other islands, and so we can only really begin to imagine the wealth of information that the Philippines will bring, and the many answers that will be answered during that time period. And of course, this cultural and natural heritage is irreplaceable and will be a source of inspiration for us and future generations. So with that, I want to thank all of you, of course, for attending today and listening to what I have to say. And in particular, of course, to the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ateneo de Manila. I think you have many advantages in having both anthropology and sociology together in one department, and I am very enthusiastic to see the work that goes forward there. I thank Dr. Pollock, Dr. Fuentes for their invitation, and of course the many colleagues, I don't list them all here, within the OXIAN consortium that is addressing some of these questions in Southeast Asia, as well as two of my students who were heavily involved in some of the work that I presented, including Dominic Goldner at the University of Tübingen, and now James Kepler here in Kentucky. So I'm happy to address any questions, and again, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Hugo. That was wonderful, very informative and very inspiring talk that encompassed actually quite a lot, and a lot of it is new information and just a result of state-of-the-art research and really thoughtful ways of collaborating and doing a very inclusive research. So thank you very much for showing that all to us. And I think we have a few questions from the audience, Aido.
Yes, we do. We do have one from Don Satumbaga. The question is, are there studies on how the mummification process have changed over time vis-a-vis changing environments?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the short of it is no. So there are some groups that have looked at some of the potential botanicals that are being used in some of the so-called fire mummies from the Cordillera region. But actually what we did was to, of course, with the permission of the community, was to take a sample for dating, because even this is not well understood. So in order to see if there is a difference in botanical use for mummification, we need to get the chronology for the different mummies that are represented today. So we have two dates at the moment. To start off, they are at different time periods. We would then need to look at some botanical remains for this. So we can approach this in a few different ways. The most straightforward would probably look to see if there are phytoliths that we could look at microscopically in some of these remains, some tissue remains. We can also try to extract DNA, not of course of the humans or of the mummies themselves, but plant DNA from these tissues as well. So it's not work that we've done, not work that we intend to do, but I agree it's a very interesting question and one that I encourage one of you to get involved in.
Thank you, Dr. Hugo. Ms. Dawn asks, is that work already published?
No, so there has been some work published on just a histological study of one of the mummy remains, but not of our dating of the mummies. That's to be published. So we're waiting for, actually we're waiting to go back to the Philippines to present this work first to the community before we can publish it.
All right. We're receiving quite a number of questions, quite a number of interests. This one is from Professor Mary Rosettis. She's from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Ateneo. She states that for AGTA groups and their academic/NGO support groups, the AGTA's own understanding of what brought them to the Philippines as the earliest pioneers can be promoted as a source of increased cultural heritage pride, so they can gain greater respect from the majority population. What do you think? Any evidence from other countries along these lines?
Yes, I think that is certainly one possibility, and I think certainly with the communities I've talked to in January of last year, you know, the Mamanwa were tremendously proud to call themselves Mamanwa, and they were one of the groups that doesn't use the term negrito. The Aeta were also tremendously proud to be Aeta. So I do think that this approach of understanding the past could be used as a way of empowering communities. At the same time, we have to be very careful of how this goes about. So what we're proposing is to try to understand how they might be representative of this very ancient migration, whether it be early modern humans into the Philippines, or whether they be representatives of even earlier hominins because of the fact that they carry this Denisovan admixture. That in itself could be viewed by some also in a negative way. Unfortunately, we've seen this in a historical context where some might say, well, and it also has to do with the way we refer to these groups. So we refer to the term modern. In some cases, we use also the term archaic. And these are first and foremost biological terms, but they're often understood as a hierarchy of culture. And this is, you know, something that we as anthropologists have to be very careful in the way we communicate. So overall, I certainly agree that this can be a source of empowerment, this kind of research. And simply, we have to be careful of how we communicate it, and in all of the process, we have to involve the communities themselves, because they might also have certain, you know, oral histories about their own origins that we need to incorporate in our communication and our models.
And there's a follow-up question from Professor Mary. She just wants to know if there are AGTA students or professionals in Philippine archaeology.
I'm sorry, if there are other students?
If there are AGTA students or professionals in Philippine archaeology.
I'm reading it here, okay. If I understand the question correctly, if there are students, so we're collaborating, I mentioned, with Ifugao State University, also Davao University, or Davao Medical Foundation, rather, in Mindanao. So we do have, you know, several collaborations of professionals. At some point, I do want to do field work in some parts, and I envision that we'll be collaborating with students supervised by some of these professional archaeologists.
Okay, and Ma'am Mylene Lacing's here, so turn you over.
Thank you very much, Ido. Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Reyes-Centeno, for your lecture. I was floored. As Alfred said, you know, the information is so fresh and so relevant, and the interdisciplinarity of the method that you've been employing, along with your highlighting of collaborative work and your focus on working with tandems. That's just, it really is so encouraging and so inspiring to hear it from an expert of your level, and to be applied to something in our context here in the Philippines. So it's really exciting. And it's also very exciting that you are using all of these, you're employing these methods, and you have been clear about your goal, which is to provide or to get to an understanding of humans. So this is very significant because it gives relevance, it expands the relevance of our work in archaeology beyond doing work just to satisfy our curiosity about very specific, very esoteric areas of study. So yeah, I really love that about your lecture. Thank you very much for being so generous and sharing all of this information with us today. Yeah, so good luck. And if there's anything that you would need from somebody in the Philippines, we are here. I'm also from the DSA in Ateneo. Thank you. It's very nice to meet you online.
Thank you very much. And yes, you know, I should say one of the reasons I'm interested in the Philippines, not only because, you know, the many research questions, the new fossil finds, the new archaeological finds, but there's been a personal connection as well. So I'm not Filipino. I'm often confused as Filipino because of my surname Reyes and Centeno. But I did interact with many Filipinos in the US. I spent about 15 years in California, and there's a community known as Mexipino or Fili-Mexican because we have a long history together, you know, as part of the diaspora in California. My parents are farm workers, and during the 60s, there was this joint civil rights movement with Mexicans and Filipinos working aside. That, and I'm sure you all know how important the galleon trade was in joining both of our countries. I'm native Mexican, and you know, it's that recent history that ties us together, but really it's that deeper time history that ties all of humanity together, and ultimately that's what I want to get at with you. So thank you for your comments, and I look forward to working with you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Mylene, and thanks, Hugo. Aido, I think we have some more questions for Dr. Reyes-Centeno?
We have one from Mara de Guzman. She's just wondering, hi, for future collaborations, will there be calls for research assistants or something similar for local universities? Universities, faculty, or students, even if from other departments, when your research group comes back for future research?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Guzman. Thank you for that. And so, in fact, the Oxen Consortium, what we plan to do, you know, depending on how the pandemic happens next year, how it plays out, is to bring in scholars from Southeast Asia, primarily the Philippines, to Europe for a training session. So I just noticed, and I think I might have misunderstood your previous question about ACTA students and how they're involved. And the work that Dr. Larena at the University of Uppsala has done in his publications, he's involved ACTA community leaders and ACTA students. So we plan to continue to do that and to have them travel to Europe if the situation is possible for training. This will probably be in Uppsala next year. And so, you know, I will be there for 2 weeks' time to do some training on some of the methods with relation to anatomical characterization, in particular dental morphology. We hope to have a linguist that can train some of our sociocultural students on collecting linguistic data. And so, yes, this exchange is in both ways. It's not just us going to the Philippines, but also bringing our scholars from the Philippines and our students from the Philippines to Europe. Now that I'm in Kentucky, you know, I don't have a specific position for a student, James Kepler, who's here and who gave a source on the mummification process. He's a student that you will probably see a lot in the Philippines going forward. But I do welcome, you know, students that are interested in pursuing studies here to contact me and look at some possibilities for that. I will have at some point a postdoctoral position available. And I welcome, of course, like supporting students interested in exchange through mechanisms like the Fulbright or other such scholarship opportunities.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think there are so many possibilities and opportunities for collaborative work in the future, and of course we are just waiting to get over with the lockdown and be able to return to the field. What do you think? What will be your timeline of going back and continue with your research?
Yeah, so the consortium was funded starting 2020, and it was intended to be for a period. So I can envision this, going certainly running up until 2024. And if we're able to delay that timeline because of the pandemic, then up to 2025. First and foremost, we do need to secure a lot of these permits before we're able to collect any data. And so I expect that we can do some training with our colleagues next year. So Filipino scholars and other Southeast Asian scholars going to Europe, and then actually start data collection then 2023. That's more or less the time frame I think is possible at the moment, unless there's a new variant that arises in between that time. But we can be hopeful for that. So that's for the OXIAN consortium specifically. EDUS Lab, which I didn't spend a lot of time, but I think is quite important because it gives us the infrastructure to do a lot of this work. That is starting now and also for the next 4 years. So it's running in parallel. And depending on fieldwork opportunities, and we can take some of the mobile units to do some of this fieldwork, starting hopefully next year, but more likely 2023.
Thanks. I'm really looking very much forward to that. So yeah, hopefully, and it won't take that long to resume really field work. Right now, I feel that time is running quite fast during the lockdown and being stuck at home all the time. So maybe that will help in this regard. I found it quite fascinating towards the end when you described your work in your laboratory. You mentioned you're doing virtual, or you're developing virtual archaeology. And I think that is something fantastic. And that is something that we have now learned we definitely need. Can you talk a little bit about that? What your plans are, or what you are already doing?
I started offering a course called digital archaeology. So sometimes we refer to it as virtual, sometimes as digital. But really, what I tell students is that, okay, there's these many methods that we can apply. Let's say multispectral imaging, as you just saw, where we can look at the different spectra of light being reflected on an object in order to try to see what otherwise we would not see. There's computed tomography, so that we can look inside, whether it be a cultural artifact or skeletal remains. And the list goes on: SEM microscopy, confocal microscopy, so forth. So these are tools. What's important, of course, is always to be able to use those tools to address specific questions and to get at a specific research program. So that's what I see virtual archaeology as how it is. But the important point is that as we begin to adopt these, our theoretical frameworks will also begin to shift in ways that we had not thought about before. And so for many scholars, they say, well, virtual archaeology, digital archaeology is just the tools. And we shouldn't support it. We shouldn't spend so much money because it is very expensive to do all of this. Recently, so this EDUS lab that we're building now here in Kentucky is being supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation with a grant of $14 million. So it's really a big investment. It really is a lot, but it really goes to show that they do understand that from a theoretical point of view, it can really shift the kinds of questions we're addressing once we see what information we can get that we did not have access to before. It shifts the kinds of questions that we ask in archaeology, and of course that are relevant for other fields, broadly anthropology and sociology as well.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. It's there's a lot of potential and new purposes for this technology that we just still learn how to value and how to use it.
Yeah, and I will say that you know, what I'm used to is an archaeological science that's developed primarily within archaeology. But what we're doing in Kentucky now with the DUCE lab is collaborating a lot with engineers, in fact. So it's been often very frustrating for us as archaeologists to go and have a machine that doesn't quite do everything we want it to do. And we say, oh, I wish, you know, it could do this, or I wish it could do that. And really, to get to that level, it's necessary to work with engineers and computer scientists because we can't learn it all. I mean, as anthropologists, we can appreciate many aspects of language, of culture, society. But when it comes to developing these tools, it really takes collaborations with those that are really devoted to that. So it's actually 4 engineers working in a DUCE lab and myself as part of this grant. And of course, we're collaborating with many more archaeologists internally and externally, but the driving force is really coming from the field of engineering.
Yes, absolutely. And anthropology and archaeology is more and more becoming a part of really a transdisciplinary research undertaking. And yeah, I remember it it's quite a while ago, but not that long ago, when archaeologists, or at least some archaeologists, had this idea or this belief that they can actually do everything that's necessary. And I think we couldn't be further from the truth. We need really a network of experts from various disciplines working and designing research projects and themes together. Also with mobile mobile laboratories, that's something that just makes, as you mentioned, things often easier, especially when it gets to the problems of issuing or applying for export permits, getting materials, artifacts, samples, etc., out of the country where you conduct your research, and you have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy more often than not. And that's also something what we are doing at the laboratory here. So with the research of Riczar in Sulawesi, it's actually much easier to bring the microscopes to the place than bringing the artifacts to the laboratory.
Right, yeah. So this is something that I think most archaeologists agree on, is that it's what's perhaps most necessary, that it's not realistic, often really not in the interest of the heritage objects that we're interested in studying, for them to travel. So it's best to bring in the resources, and more importantly, I would say, and this is where I think our consortium is excelling, is in doing training and in doing collaborations in the places that we're working on. So not just going in with our machines, but also, of course, training local scholars. And they really often do more training, and they train us actually a lot more often in understanding the context of the local archaeological sites and potential questions that we might not have really appreciated before.
Yeah, absolutely. May I have a question, if I may? I found it very interesting when you presented the research on the mummies and applying methods like multispectral imaging. Also, that it seems that there's a lot of details to be discovered, like all those tattoos. And then I remember that the earliest tattoos that I remember is from Ötzi, from the Iceman in the Austrian Alps. But I darkly know that this is by far not the oldest. There's much older evidence for tattoos and tattooing. Would you know a bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know the oldest evidence of it. I don't know if James Kepler, who's on here, might have this, because this will be one of his areas of research. But it is an interesting question. We do see, certainly thousand-of-year-old tattoos in various sections and various parts of the world. So not just in Europe, in the case of Ötzi, or Asia, but really in many parts of the world. And the difference, or really the unique aspect in the cases of the Kabayan mummies, or so-called fire mummies in the Philippines, is that you just have tattoos, covering entire bodies in such details that it's unlike anything we do see at earlier time periods. So I don't know the oldest, but I do know that in terms of complexity and coverage of the body, really it's in the Philippines where we find the most detailed tattooing. And there has been, from the archaeological records, some, in sites in Kalinga, relatively recent sites in Kalinga, objects that are proposed to be used for tattooing. This is not something I've looked into carefully, but it is in the literature that from, you have the mummies dating to, just a few hundred years ago, but in the archaeological record, things that could have potentially been used for putting ink in skin. So it's again another area of research that could be developed in Luzon and in the Cordilleras. Yeah, good question. I see a question from Dr. Quinto Lising about the tattooing, whether it was happening during the lifetime of the individual or post-mortem after death. And so they were tattoos that were primarily done during the lifetime of the individual. There is in Kalinga today practice of tattooing, and actually both within the Philippines and in the diaspora, so Filipinos and Filipino Americans, for example, are sort of bringing back tattooing patterns that they see in some of these mummies as a way of recognizing their heritage. So there's that sociological aspect for those of you in the sociology part of the department that is very interesting to study. And the same would have been the case for some of these conserved mummies, is that the tattooing would have happened during their lifetime. We don't know exactly, of course, whether it all happened at once. Likely not. It likely would have been, the body seen as a canvas. And this is one of the questions that the community is interested in understanding, is what do these symbols represent? Some of them, they have told us, are also portrayed in their textiles. And so they can interpret that based on representations that they see in the mummies and they see in textiles together. And in other cases, they have ideas, but may not necessarily have a direct interpretation. And that's where the ethnographic and sociological component would come in to try to understand that process.
Right, thanks. Aido, do we have any more questions? Sorry, I just kept on talking and forgot that there might be other questions.
We do not have questions at the moment. We do have a participant, James Kepler, in the chat box, who is sharing with us important notes and details, and the other participants may want to read it as well. but we highly encourage everyone to ask.
Yeah, thank you, James. And this was indeed the source I was referencing as evidence for tools used in tattooing. Now, what's interesting is that some of the patterns that are found in some of these mummies is not really similar to what is used today in Kalinga. So it seems that there was some discontinuity between the patterns being used today versus those in the past. And while there has been this resurgence, as I mentioned, with particularly diaspora Filipino communities, in general, it is a dying art. So not a lot of there are not a lot of tattoo makers in the Kalinga region anymore. And I should say, reiterate that this is the same region where we find that very early human occupation 700,000 years ago. So it really spans what we've been talking about, a very long time period, and getting to in between, particularly in nearby Luzon, up until the 700,000 years is really to be studied. And one of the reasons why the Philippines is such an exciting place to be an archaeologist at the moment.
I fully agree. Actually, Mylene, who is one of the members of the Kalinga team that found and excavated rhinoceros and artifact assemblage that was spread around. And yeah, we since quite a long time, since the times of Otley Baya, that there was this assumption that the Philippines has a very early record of human presence, but the dating was really the problem. Usually you would have finds on the surface or very close to the surface without any possibility to directly or securely date them. And this has now changed with the Kalinga discoveries and the project. And that is indeed extremely important. We still have to deal, you mentioned that in the beginning, we still have to deal with that huge gap between the 700K of Kalinga, or possibly even earlier than that. And then there's nothing until maybe 67,000 years ago. And we are still puzzled why that is so. Was there nobody in the Philippines, or did we just not find the sites yet? So there's definitely a lot of more research coming up, and a lot of more research necessary for us to do.
Yes, and your remark reminds me of the fact that what I didn't show you is some of the most recent work by Dr. Arena at University of Uppsala, where he's looking at genomic diversity in these different Negrito populations from Mindanao to Luzon. And what he's seeing is that because of these differences in Denisovan proportions in the different populations, it likely was the case that there was not just one entry into the Filipino archipelago, but probably multiple entries, one perhaps from what is now Palawan, that in earlier time periods would have been more easily connected to other parts of the Philippines, and perhaps on another northern entry as well. So that would be at a very early time period. For this, of course, we need not only more archaeological evidence with regards to fossil or human skeletal remains or cultural remains, but also paleoenvironmental reconstructions of these different regions. So that will really be crucial in tying things together. So that's, at the deep tide periods. And then I mentioned the Austronesian expansion, and there has been the dominant hypothesis that the Austronesian expansion happens from China, Taiwan to the rest of Southeast Asia through the Philippines and so forth. And we're really beginning to question this model now. Perhaps, it's much more complicated than that. It's perhaps Austronesian expansion first into the Philippines and then into Taiwan. this is something also that we want to explore a bit further, and one of the main reasons why we want to collect linguistic data in the Philippines as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a much higher mobility that we can expect for a much earlier period. The research, the recent research we did in Mindoro, but also in Sulawesi, shows that already practically the first modern humans that arrived had the capacity for open seafaring, and they had adaptation to crossing the oceans, to reaching distant islands, like in the case of Talaud and Leang Saru. And they were very well adapted to the sea and exploiting marine resources. We have in Mindoro, we have finds, remains of pelagic fishes that goes back to 35,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier than that. And that includes large predatory fishes like sharks. And they were able to, they had the technology and the skills to do that and to catch those very large fishes. So there's a certain adaptation to this maritime environment that's already quite evident at such an early time, associated with say the earliest indication for modern human presence in the oceanic part of the Philippines.
Yes. Yes, and Mindoro, I think Mindoro is a great place to look at not only the first human occupation, but also this idea of Austronesian expansion from the south rather than from the north.
We have one more question, one last, I guess, question. But yeah, I do agree with challenging existing models, because oftentimes when we idolize or we subscribe to one specific model, it becomes more concealing rather than revealing. So there's a lot of interest in the final part of your presentation, particularly on tattoos. I'm not particularly sure why, but maybe the concept is just so interdisciplinary in nature that I also see it as a point of convergence between the disciplines. So this one's another one from Dawn Situmbaga. She asked that, are there similar practices of tattooing and mummification in indigenous communities in Taiwan? I may be wrong about this assumption, but if Taiwan indigenous populations are related to Cordilleran populations, it would be interesting to see if the practice is unique to Cordillera.
Yeah, that's a great question. To start off, we do see that Cordilleran populations today are related to East Asian populations from Taiwan and China as well. So of course, depending on the sampling strategy, but they would have more affinities to those populations than the Negrito, for example. In terms of mummification processes in Taiwan, I have not seen similar mummification processes, but it is observed in the south of China in terms of using this firing kind of approach. Whether the botanicals are the same or similar has not been explored, so I cannot say about that. Tattooing itself is not observed in those southern Chinese models. So it looks like they're, in both cases, both in the Cordilleras and in southern China, they're using some kind of smoking strategy for mummification. But whether this is, from common descent, let's say, so from a shared ancestry of practice or convergence, we won't know until we have good dates, both in the Cordilleran case as well as the Chinese case. And in this multidisciplinary context, develop really more of a context for them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering all the questions.
It looks like James, who's more of an expert by now than I am, has something to add. So there is some in indigenous Taiwanese groups, but not as extensive. Yeah, and so again, reiterating that you know, just the amount of coverage in the body, we don't see anything like this at, you know, at that time period, pre-colonial time period, as we do in the Cordilleras today. So it's really an exceptional case.
I think we have another comment from James Kepler in the chat box.
Yeah, and then adding, so the practice of tattooing has been extinct. I presume this is referring to Taiwan, James, since the 1930s. This is perhaps due to colonization, European colonization. So I know in the Filipino case, most of the tattooing practices in that form of the Cordilleras, you know, it stopped being practiced during Spanish colonial era. So afterward, or at least, you know, really highly diminished after that time, such that the communities we've spoken to really have no idea about what botanicals are being used. And so this is why they're interested in getting at that, because there's been a big gap of practicing this mummification process since colonization until today.
Thanks again, Hugo. And Aido, do we have any more questions? Or that's...
Unfortunately, we do not have questions anymore, even in the live stream. But we are really grateful for Dr. Hugo. He's been patiently answering our questions, of course.
Yes, and thank you all. I appreciate all the questions. I hope to hear from some of you in the future if you're interested in some of this work. And you know, it's an open door in my laboratory, and I welcome further collaboration. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very kind and very encouraging. So yeah, we are actually just on time. It's 11:30 now, and maybe before we end this webinar, maybe let me just announce our next speaker. So this will be Dr. Graham Barker of the University of Cambridge, who is another most influential and prominent archaeologist of our time, and whose excavations in the Great Nia caves in Borneo have significantly influenced and shaped modern archaeology in Southeast Asia. And he will be with us next Tuesday at 3 p.m. and give us new insights into Neanderthals from his excavations at another famous site, Shanidar Cave in Iraq. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Thank you to our very distinguished guest and speaker, Dr. Hugo Reyes-Centeno. That was really wonderful. It's always a pleasure to see you and to hear and discuss your research with you. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.